Dan hari ini eventnya dihadiri oleh pembicara-pembicara yang sudah sangat paham soal isu hukuman mati, dan harapan kami dapat memandu kawan-kawan peserta untuk memahami lebih dalam soal isu ini dan mengapa penghapusan hukuman mati di seluruh dunia menjadi sangat penting. Masing-masing pembicara akan kami alokasikan waktu sekitar 12 sampai 15 menit untuk memaparkan materi mereka masing-masing. Dan kawan-kawan peserta kami dorong untuk memberikan pertanyaan melalui fitur Q&A yang berada di Zoom bagi kawan-kawan yang bergabung di Zoom, maupun melalui komentar di kolom YouTube, karena event ini juga kami siarkan secara langsung di YouTube Amnesty International Indonesia. Sekali lagi saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada para pembicara dan kawan-kawan semua, dan tanpa berpanjang lebar lagi, saya akan memanggil pembicara pertama kita, yakni Ari Pramuditya. Beliau adalah peneliti dari Amnesty International Indonesia. Sebelum bergabung dengan Amnesty International Indonesia, Ari berkecimpung di ICJR, kemudian juga Asia Foundation, kemudian juga di hukum online. Kepada Saudara Ari, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih kepada Aldo selaku moderator. Sebelumnya yang saya hormati rekan saya Afif dari LBHM, kemudian ada Katrina dari Amnesty Malaysia, nanti juga akan bergabung dengan kita Dr. Farah dari Suhakam, kemudian ada Kasturi yang sebelumnya menjabat di Parlemen Malaysia, serta rekan-rekan media dan teman-teman semua yang menyaksikan acara peluncuran laporan global hukuman mati Amnesty International tahun 2022. Laporan ini mencakup angka vonis dan eksekusi hukuman mati yang dilakukan secara yudisial atau yang melalui proses pengadilan untuk periode Januari hingga Desember 2022. Mohon bantuannya untuk ditampilkan slide-nya. Baik, terima kasih. Masih sama seperti tahun-tahun sebelumnya, informasi vonis dan eksekusi hukuman mati dalam laporan ini dikumpulkan dari berbagai sumber, antara lain angka resmi dari negara, putusan pengadilan, informasi dari keluarga, orang yang dijatuhi hukuman mati maupun pengacaranya, laporan media, serta informasi dari organisasi masyarakat sipil yang memantau isu hukuman mati. Boleh next? Yang pertama, untuk total vonis hukuman mati secara global. Amnesty mencatat adanya penurunan angka vonis hukuman mati baru pada tahun 2022, yaitu setidaknya 2052 pada tahun 2021, menjadi setidaknya sekarang 2016 pada tahun 2022. Penurunan angka vonis mati baru ini disebabkan oleh beberapa hal. Setidaknya pertama, Amnesty tidak menerima informasi tentang angka resmi vonis hukuman mati yang dijatuhkan di beberapa negara, seperti Nigeria dan Sri Lanka. Negara-negara tersebut sebelumnya memberikan informasi resmi terkait angka vonis mati baru kepada Amnesty. Namun pada tahun 2022, informasi tersebut tidak diberikan. Selain itu, di tahun 2022 juga terdapat beberapa negara seperti Kamerun, Jepang, Maroko, Sahara Barat, Oman, Sierra Leone, Uganda, dan beberapa negara lainnya juga tidak menjatuhkan vonis hukuman mati baru. Yang mana negara-negara tersebut sebelumnya tercatat menjatuhkan vonis mati pada tahun 2021. Yang pasti yang perlu diingat bahwa di banyak negara, angka penerapan hukuman mati merupakan angka minimum yang bisa dicatat oleh Amnesty. Artinya, Amnesty meyakini bahwa angka sebenarnya bisa lebih tinggi. Beberapa negara, misalnya seperti China, Korea Utara, Vietnam, terus menyembunyikan penerapan hukuman mati mereka dengan membatasi akses terhadap informasi terkait hukuman mati. Banyak negara memberikan informasi resmi tentang penerapan hukuman mati mereka, termasuk tidak memberikan permintaan khusus yang dibuat oleh Amnesty International. Bisa next? Bisa rekan-rekan sekalian lihat, ini merupakan list negara yang menjatuhkan vonis mati secara global di tahun 2022. Spesifik untuk Cina, data penerapan hukuman mati diklasifikasikan sebagai rahasia negara. Cina belum mempublikasikan angka hukuman mati mereka, namun Amnesty mendapatkan informasi yang menunjukkan bahwa setiap tahun ribuan orang dieksekusi dan dijatuhi hukuman mati. Untuk itu kami mencantumkan 1000 plus. Lalu kalau ada simbol plus di situ, itu yang muncul setelah angka di sebelah negara, misalnya contohnya Bangladesh 169 plus, itu berarti Amnesty berhasil mengkonfirmasi setidaknya 169 vonis hukuman mati, tapi meyakini ada lebih dari itu jumlahnya. Lalu apabila ada simbol plus setelah nama negara tanpa angka, misalnya seperti Suriah plus, berarti Amnesty membenarkan adanya eksekusi lebih dari satu di negara tersebut, tapi tidak memiliki informasi yang memadai untuk memberikan angka minimum yang kredibel. Seperti itu gambarannya. Bisa next. Jumlah vonis hukuman mati berkurang di beberapa negara, termasuk di Indonesia. Meskipun pengurangannya di Indonesia, kalau menurut catatan kami hanya 2 angka dari tahun 2021. Bisa rekan-rekan lihat di situ, Amnesty mencatat penurunan vonis hukuman mati, di antaranya ada Bangladesh, dari setidaknya 181 pada tahun 2021 menjadi setidaknya 169 di tahun 2022. Lalu Indonesia, dari setidaknya 114 pada tahun 2021 menjadi setidaknya 112 pada tahun 2022. Di situ bisa dilihat ada Vietnam dan seterusnya. Bisa rekan-rekan lihat di slide kami. Dan untuk angka yang lebih komprehensif nanti bisa dilihat di laporan kami. Next. Nah, tapi di sisi lain, Amnesty juga mencatat bahwa terjadi peningkatan vonis baru di beberapa negara. Bisa rekan-rekan lihat seperti di Aljazair, Mesir, yang angkanya sangat kontras dibandingkan dengan negara lainnya, dari setidaknya 356 di tahun 2021 menjadi 538 di 2022, lalu ada India, Kenya, dan seterusnya. Rekan-rekan bisa melihat di slide kami, dan untuk angka yang lebih komprehensif juga bisa dilihat dan dibaca nanti di laporan kami. Next. Oke, bisa next. Oke, mungkin saya lanjutkan terlebih dahulu. Jadi tadi kita membahas angka vonis ya. Sekarang kita akan membicarakan soal eksekusinya. Mungkin untuk teman-teman admin, mohon bantuannya untuk next dulu slide-nya. Kita bisa melihat nanti angkanya meningkat, gitu ya, dan ironis karena berbanding terbalik dengan jumlah vonis barunya yang menurun dari tahun 2021. Jadi sekarang angkanya itu meningkat ke tahun 2022. Setidaknya 883 orang dieksekusi pada tahun 2022. Angka ini meningkat sebanyak 53% dari tahun 2021 dengan 579 eksekusi. Amnesty mencatat angka eksekusi di tahun 2022 ini bahkan merupakan yang tertinggi dalam 6 tahun terakhir atau sejak tahun 2017. Angka tercatat ini bahkan belum mencakup angka eksekusi yang dilakukan di Cina, Korea Utara, dan Vietnam, di mana Amnesty meyakini terdapat banyak eksekusi dilakukan. Nah, salah satu penyebab utama meningkatnya angka ini adalah tingginya angka eksekusi mati terhadap terpidana kasus narkotika, dengan jumlah 325 eksekusi dari total 833 eksekusi, atau sekitar 37% dari total eksekusi global. Angka eksekusi narkotika ini kemudian meningkat lebih dari 2 kali lipat apabila dibandingkan dengan eksekusi untuk kasus narkotika di tahun 2021 yang berjumlah 134 eksekusi. Selain itu, meningkatnya angka eksekusi ini juga disebabkan melonjaknya angka eksekusi di beberapa negara ya, di Timur Tengah dan di Afrika Utara dengan total 825 eksekusi atau 93% dari total eksekusi secara global. Nah, dari 825 angka tadi, 576-nya disumbang oleh Iran dan 196-nya oleh Arab Saudi. Nah, yang paling menarik perhatian adalah di Iran dan Arab Saudi tersebut, eksekusi mati untuk kasus narkotika menempati urutan kasus yang sangat tinggi. Jadi kalau kita tarik kesimpulan, narkotika masih menjadi penyumbang besar terhadap meningkatnya angka eksekusi mati secara global. Rekan-rekan. Oke, slide-nya masih belum bisa ditampilkan ya. Nggak apa-apa, saya akan lanjut dulu. Ada 4 negara, ya ini betul slide-nya, 4 negara dengan jumlah eksekusi terbanyak. Jadi apabila diurutkan berdasarkan pemantauan kami, itu ada Iran 576 setidaknya eksekusi, Arab Saudi 166, Mesir 24, dan Amerika Serikat. keempat negara ini aja itu sudah menyumbang kurang lebih dari 97,5% dari semua total eksekusi yang diketahui dan bisa diverifikasi oleh Amnesty untuk tahun 2022, yaitu 833 eksekusi tadi. Boleh next dulu. Kemudian ini adalah beberapa negara yang tercatat telah melakukan eksekusi sepanjang tahun 2022. Bisa dilihat angkanya oleh rekan-rekan, nanti angka ini juga terdapat di laporan kami yang bisa diakses melalui website kami. Bisa next dulu. Oke, beberapa negara dengan peningkatan jumlah eksekusi. Dari beberapa negara yang tercatat, setidaknya ada beberapa negara yang mencatatkan peningkatan eksekusi berdasarkan pemantauan kami. Di antara lain Iran, yang angkanya cukup menonjol ya, dari 314 menjadi 576, kemudian ada Arab Saudi, ada Singapura, yang bahkan di tahun 2021 nol, sekarang ada 11 kurang lebih, dan Amerika Serikat. Untuk datanya nanti bisa dilihat secara lengkap di laporan kami. Boleh next dulu. Oke, sekarang beberapa negara dengan penurunan jumlah eksekusi. Meskipun ada beberapa negara naik, tapi jumlah negara yang mengalami penurunan juga tidak sedikit. Di antara lain ada Mesir, ya meskipun ada penurunan, tapi angkanya masih tinggi ya. Dari 83 di tahun 2021 menjadi 24 di 2022. Kemudian ada Jepang, Irak, dan Somalia. Datanya bisa rekan-rekan lihat langsung di layar atau nanti lengkapnya di laporan kami. Mungkin bisa next dulu. Ada 576 orang dieksekusi di Iran sepanjang tahun 2022. Angkanya sangat mengerikan. Meningkat 84% dari tahun 2021. Sebelumnya 314 eksekusi. Nah, yang perlu menjadi catatan adalah eksekusi yang terjadi di Iran ini meningkat untuk pembunuhan sebesar 75% dari 159 tahun 2021 menjadi 279 pada tahun 2022. Dan meningkat secara tajam dan signifikan untuk kejahatan terkait narkotika sebesar 93% dari 132 tahun 2021 menjadi 255 tahun 2022. Jadi kalau kita lihat penyumbang besar eksekusi di Iran yang luar biasa adalah kejahatan terkait narkotika. Bisa di next dulu. Ini sekedar informasi pada rekan-rekan, beberapa metode eksekusi di berbagai negara, ada penggal, ada hukuman gantung, ada suntik mati, dan ditembak. Salah satunya juga termasuk di Indonesia, metode hukuman mati di Indonesia. Berdasarkan Undang-Undang Nomor 2 PNPS tahun 64, metode eksekusi mati di Indonesia ini adalah dengan cara ditembak sampai mati. Gitu ya. Next, boleh? Sekarang kita masuk ke Asia Pasifik. Tadi kita udah banyak bicara soal global, kita akan lihat situasi di Asia Pasifik. Jadi berdasarkan pemantauan Amnesty, Cina saat ini masih menjadi algojo hukuman mati nomor 1 di dunia. Kami meyakini bahwa vonis dan hukum eksekusi mati di Cina ini totalnya mencapai ribuan ya. Cuman karena alasan informasi tidak bisa diakses oleh kami karena informasi ini diklasifikasikan sebagai rahasia negara, jadi kami tidak dapat mengakses informasi ini secara resmi. Sama seperti di Korea Utara dan Vietnam, tidak memungkinkan Amnesty untuk memverifikasi laporan eksekusi mati. Jumlah vonis hukuman mati baru yang tercatat secara regional tahun 2022 ini meningkat 5% dibandingkan dengan tahun 2021. Ada beberapa alasan, karena sekarang Thailand juga memberikan data kepada kita yang sebelumnya tidak. Kemudian ada kenaikan signifikan juga di tahun 2022 ini dengan 165 vonis hukuman mati dibandingkan dengan 2021 dengan 144 vonis. Angka tertinggi sejak tahun 2000 di India. Ini juga beberapa penyebab meningkatnya angka di Asia Pasifik. Gitu ya. Lalu bisa rekan-rekan lihat juga di Myanmar, otoritas militer pertama kalinya melakukan eksekusi mati dalam 4 dekade terakhir secara sewenang-wenang merampas hidup 4 orang, termasuk 2 politisi yang terkenal setelah proses yang sangat tidak adil dan rahasia. Kemudian ada negara tetangga kita, Papua Nugini, yang menjadi negara ke-21 yang menghapuskan hukuman mati untuk semua kejahatan. Lalu di Maladewa dan Presiden Sri Lanka yang masing-masing menegaskan bahwa hukuman mati tidak lagi diterapkan di negara mereka. Jadi ini merupakan apa namanya tren yang baik sekali. Bisa next, kita akan masuk ke posisi Indonesia sekarang. Next lagi, satu lagi. Oke, ini yang part yang menurut saya penting ya, paling ditunggu. Jadi di Amnesty mencatat bahwa penurunan angka vonis mati di Indonesia menurun dari tahun 2022 dengan setidaknya 112 vonis mati baru turun 2 angka dibandingkan dengan tahun 2021. Ada pengurangan meskipun tidak signifikan. Ini merupakan sesuatu yang arahnya sebenarnya positif, tapi angkanya cukup tinggi. Dan yang paling penting untuk digarisbawahi adalah disumbang oleh kasus narkotika. Yang tadi sempat saya sampaikan juga, angkanya kurang lebih 94% dari total kasus keseluruhan, yaitu 105 vonis dari setidaknya 112 vonis yang tercatat. Jadi memang sejak kepemimpinan Presiden Joko Widodo, Presiden bersikeras untuk memerangi kejahatan terkait narkotika atau war on drugs, itu yang kemudian digaungkan oleh pemerintah. Hal ini tentunya berdampak signifikan terhadap penjatuhan vonis hukuman mati terhadap kasus narkotika. Mungkin bisa next dulu.
Pak Ari, mohon maaf sekali, namun waktunya sudah habis.
Oke, kalau gitu. Sebenarnya masih ada beberapa gambaran lagi terkait situasi di Indonesia. Cuman kita bisa diskusi soal ini nanti, termasuk kenapa penyebabnya di Indonesia ini juga angkanya masih cukup tinggi. Dan apa rekomendasi dari Amnesty. Cuman saya akan
Ya,
kembalikan dulu ke moderator. Terima kasih, moderator.
terima kasih banyak atas paparannya, Mas Ari. Dari paparan Mas Ari kita bisa mengetahui bahwa masih banyak negara-negara di dunia yang menggunakan hukuman mati dan kasus narkotika menjadi penyumbang terbesar, begitu ya. Namun kawan-kawan partisipan jangan khawatir karena nanti kita masih ada sesi tanya jawab. Jadi jika ada pertanyaan lebih jauh terkait misalnya situasi di tingkat regional maupun di Indonesia yang ingin ditanyakan ke Mas Ari, kawan-kawan masih memiliki kesempatan. Terima kasih sekali lagi untuk Mas Ari. Berikutnya saya ingin memanggil Bang Afif. Apakah Bang Afif masih ada di ruangan?
Yes, masih. Tapi saya nggak bisa nyalain ya, atau udah bisa dibuka ya videonya?
Seharusnya tidak ada masalah, Bang Afif. Namun bagi kawan-kawan
Soalnya di stop.
teknis dari Amnesty mungkin bisa membantu Bang Afif selagi kawan-kawan Amnesty mengutak-atik teknisnya. Saya ingin memperkenalkan Bang Afif ke kawan-kawan sekalian. Bang Afif atau Muhammad Afif adalah Direktur LBH Masyarakat. Beliau sudah lama berkecimpung di isu-isu yang juga dikerjakan oleh LBH Masyarakat, seperti isu-isu seputar hukuman mati tentu saja, kemudian narkotika, kemudian hak-hak kelompok minoritas dan termarginalkan, juga soal kesehatan mental dan hak perempuan dan anak. Baru-baru ini LBH Masyarakat juga memberikan tanggapan atas pemberian gerasi terhadap terpidana mati Merri Utami yang hari ini akan kita selami lebih dalam dengan dipandu oleh Bang Afif. Begitu kawan-kawan, Bang Afif sudah siap?
Siap.
Oke, baik. Waktunya sekitar 12 menit ya Bang Afif, silakan.
Ya, oke. Terima kasih Bung Aldo dan juga Pak Ari dan juga rekan-rekan Amnesty di Indonesia ataupun di Malaysia serta para hadirin atas kesempatannya. Saya mungkin akan sekilas menyampaikan soal kasus Merri Utami yang tadi sudah disinggung sedikit oleh Bung Aldo terkait dengan gerasinya yang dikabulkan oleh Presiden Jokowi 1 bulan yang lalu. Nah, mungkin sebelum lebih jauh, saya ingin menyampaikan juga bahwa LBHM selama ini dari awal sampai 2023 berdiri, itu hampir kurang lebih 15 tahun, memang fokus terhadap penghapusan hukuman mati. Nah, dalam konteks gerakan bantuan hukum, ujung tombak kami dalam menyelamatkan terdakwa yang diancam hukuman mati adalah legal assistance ataupun pendampingan hukum di pengadilan. Nah, sejak periode 2015 sampai dengan 2017 memang kasus-kasus hukuman mati yang ditangani oleh LBHM itu di angka 15 kasus, dan itu kebanyakan kasus yang sudah exhausted gitu ya, menyisakan upaya hukum peninjauan kembali, case review ataupun clemency. Nah, kasus Merri Utami ini datang ke kami itu sekitar 3 bulan menjelang eksekusi. Nah, sesuai dengan eksekusi gelombang ketiga itu kan di Juli 2016. Kalau kita bacanya, itu eksekusinya ternyata Juli. Nah, berarti kalau 3 bulannya di kisaran April, karena pada saat itu heboh akan dilaksanakan eksekusi gelombang ketiga setelah Lebaran. Nah, pada saat itu kami berada di lapangan dan yang paling intens merilis nama terpidana mati itu adalah Polda Jawa Tengah. Nah, kami belajar dari data itu, kami identifikasi sehingga kami menemukan ada terpidana mati perempuan dari rilis itu yang kami investigasi lebih lanjut dan ketemu nama Merri Utami. Nah, terkait dengan Merri Utami, kalau kita lihat profilnya pada saat rilis itu nama-nama terpidana mati yang kasusnya mungkin antara tahun 2000 sampai dengan tahun 2005. Nah, bisa di next rekan-rekan slide-nya. Nah, kalau di profiling kasusnya Merri Utami di awal-awal itu kita kaitkan dengan pers rilisnya Polda Jawa Tengah, itu kasus yang mungkin terjadi antara tahun 2000 sampai dengan tahun 2005 dengan barang bukti jenis narkotika heroin, barang buktinya di atas 1 kilogram. Nah, kita memprofiling itu dan menemukan nama Merri Utami. Kami koordinasi dengan tim yang ada di Jakarta untuk menemui Merri Utami, karena pada saat itu Merri Utami ditahan di salah satu lapas di Banten, di lapas perempuan Tangerang. Nah, kami koordinasi juga tim yang ada di Jakarta dengan Komnas Perempuan, jadi kami beruntung dapat asistensi dari Komnas Perempuan, karena bagaimanapun juga Komnas Perempuan adalah lembaga negara yang punya akses terhadap beberapa tempat yang fokus terhadap perlindungan perempuan. Nah, pada saat itu kami yang berada di lapangan mendapatkan informasi bahwa tim yang ada di Jakarta bertemu dengan Merri Utami. Nah, pada saat itu kami berdasarkan informasi yang ada di tim yang ada di Jakarta, mereka berhasil bertemu, namun Merri Utami pada saat itu terlihat biasa-biasa aja, seperti tidak kepikiran untuk menghadapi eksekusi mati karena namanya beredar dalam list-list daftar terpidana mati yang siap dieksekusi. Nah, dan pada saat itu pun juga Merri Utami menyampaikan bahwa dia memiliki penasihat hukum dan proses upaya hukum PK-nya sedang berjalan di Mahkamah Agung. Nah, menjelang 5 hari kemudian kami ditelepon oleh Devi, anaknya Merri Utami, bahwa dia meminta bantuan kami terkait dengan bantuan hukum, namun janjian di Kejari kantor Kejaksaan Negeri Cilacap yang ada di dekat Nusa Kambangan. Dan pada saat itu kami menemuinya karena pada saat itu juga kami menangani Humphrey Jefferson yang terpidana mati warga negara Nigeria yang dieksekusi juga pada gelombang ketiga berbarengan dengan Merri Utami. Nah, di hari pertama mungkin tim ini membagi 2 tim. Yang pertama saya dan rekan saya, dan juga rekan yang lainnya ada 2 orang, antara tim yang membackup Humphrey dan juga tim yang membackup Merri Utami. Namun di dermaga Sodong yang mau masuk ke Pulau Nusa Kambangan itu, tim Merri Utami nggak bisa masuk karena soal administrasi bantuan hukum. Jadi kami yang membackup Humphrey bisa melihat pada saat itu hari pertama Merri tidak didampingi oleh kuasa hukum, sehingga kami melihat bahwa ini sangat perlu asistensi lebih lanjut. Nah, namun kami pada saat itu menyelipkan bahwa ada gerasi yang harus segera diajukan kepada Presiden, sehingga Devi pada saat itu kami minta agar untuk diajukan gerasi dan ditandatangani oleh Merri Utami. Makanya kalau kita lihat di dokumennya gerasi, itu gerasinya ditandatangani oleh Merri Utaminya langsung. Nah, sementara di hari pertama pun juga kami mendapatkan informasi bahwa putusan peninjauan kembalinya itu dikirimkan, berarti menjelang eksekusi putusan Mahkamah Agung tentang peninjauan kembali baru diterima. Jadi kelihatan bahwa Merri Utami sudah siap untuk dieksekusi. Meskipun lagi-lagi bahwa ada proses gerasi yang harus dihormati, karena bagaimanapun juga aturannya Undang-Undang Gerasi menyatakan kalau keputusan gerasinya belum diterima maka eksekusi matinya bisa ditunda sampai keputusannya itu diterima. Nah, di hari kedua kemudian kami datang lagi. Nah, di hari kedua ini emang agak sedikit urgent karena sudah langsung ke hal-hal yang teknis. Tim kejaksaan meminta Merri Utami permintaan-permintaan terakhirnya. Kemudian kami pada saat itu tim yang membackup Merri Utami menyampaikan kepada jaksa agar mencatat di dalam dokumen negara itu permintaan terakhir Merri Utami bahwa dia sedang mengajukan gerasi, karena tim yang ada di Jakarta setelah mendapatkan surat gerasi dari Merri Utami langsung ke pengadilan. Nah, berbekal dari pengadilan itu kemudian dikirimkan lagi kami menyampaikan itu ke kejaksaan. Nah, namun sayangnya kejaksaan menolak, tapi setelah berdiskusi alot akhirnya mau nggak mau itu harus dicatat. Nah, di hari kedua ini pun juga kami melihatnya sepertinya ini tanda-tanda eksekusi meskipun belum ada informasi yang valid, tapi rasa-rasanya adanya tes kesehatan, karena pada hari kedua pun juga Merri Utami disuruh untuk tes kesehatan meskipun kami tidak melihatnya karena sudah sore menunggu dokternya yang lama. Jadi persiapan untuk eksekusi semakin dekat. Nah, sepulangnya di hari kedua ini kami melihat juga jalanan yang sudah di blokade gitu. Jadi bus yang kami tumpangi itu berjalan zigzag seperti kalau misalnya ada demonstran gitu tidak boleh melewati batas dari barikade itu. Nah, di barikade itu kebetulan tempat eksekusi matinya di Lembah Nirbaya di Nusa Kambangan. Nah, selepas melewati barikade, kemudian kami bertanya-tanya apakah malam nanti akan ada eksekusi? Karena sepengetahuan kami dalam aturannya itu 72 jamnya itu mungkin akan berakhir di besok harinya. Jadi tidak mungkin kalau misalnya kejaksaan melawan ketentuan dalam undang-undang tentang pelaksanaan pidana mati bahwa notifikasi itu harus 72 jam untuk melaksanakan eksekusi mati. Nah, di titik itu kita mempertanyakan terus hingga benar pada malam harinya kami mendapatkan informasi bahwa eksekusi akan dilakukan malam, karena lalu lalang mobil ambulan juga sudah menjadi bukti bahwa biasanya kalau mobil ambulan sudah masuk itu udah mempersiapkan eksekusinya. Nah, setelah dini hari pihak dari kejaksaan dan juga kepolisian melakukan konversi pers menyampaikan bahwa dari 14 terpidana mati hanya 4 yang dieksekusi mati, diantaranya klien kami Humphrey dan juga Freddy Budiman yang mungkin teman-teman juga ketahui. Namun Merri Utami berhasil lolos, namun sayangnya eksekusi matinya itu ditunda sampai dengan batas waktu yang tidak diketahui. Nah, karena eksekusi matinya ditunda, jadi kemudian kami memastikan ini Merri Utami ada di mana. Karena lapas di Nusa Kambangan itu tidak ada tempat buat perempuan, dan kami memastikan agar Merri Utami bisa dipindahkan kembali ke lapas semula, yaitu di lapas Tangerang. Namun kami mendapatkan informasi ternyata siang harinya Merri Utami sudah dipindahkan ke lapas Cilacap. Jadi dekat dengan Pulau Nusa Kambangan lapasnya. Nah, selama di lapas Cilacap ini emang masalahnya adalah Merri Utami masih mengalami trauma terkait dengan proses atau rangkaian eksekusi mati. Makanya ketika dia sering mendengar jeruji besi yang dibuka itu sering terngiang pada saat rangkaian eksekusi matinya. Nah, setelah proses di Nusa Kambangan kami selesaikan, karena kami juga harus mendampingi Humphrey yang dikremasi di sekitaran Nusa Kambangan. Kemudian kami tim berangkat ke Jakarta. Di sana juga kami bersama teman-teman koalisi hapus hukuman mati menyampaikan pengaduan ke Ombudsman terkait dengan eksekusi mati yang kami duga ini sepertinya maladministrasi, dan benar di tahun 2017, tahun kemudian itu Ombudsman menyatakan bahwa eksekusi mati tahun 2016 adalah maladministrasi karena ada dua persoalan utama. Yang pertama adalah PK yang tidak lebih dari 1 kali itu merupakan kontradiksi dengan putusan Mahkamah Konstitusi yang sudah membatalkan bahwa PK bisa lebih dari 1 kali. Itu yang pertama. Dan yang kedua adalah notifikasi eksekusi mati yang 72 jam itu ternyata tidak sampai, sehingga menurut penilaian kami ini terlalu terburu-buru eksekusi matinya. Nah, di sepanjang tahun 2016 pun juga kami mengajukan aksi di depan kejaksaan terkait dengan dukungan untuk pemindahan Merri Utami, termasuk diantaranya ke Komnas HAM dan juga ke Komnas Perempuan. Nah, next di tahun
Bang Afif, mohon maaf sekali, namun waktunya sudah habis, Bang Afif.
Oh, oke.
Walaupun aku tahu sepertinya proses advokasi pemberian gerasi Merri Utami masih panjang dan paparannya Bang Afif juga masih panjang.
Iya.
Namun mungkin bisa dilanjutkan nanti ya Bang Afif ketika sesi tanya jawab gitu.
Oke, boleh. Sorry banget ya Bung Aldo dan teman-teman.
Nggak apa-apa. Atau misalnya apakah Bang Afif nggak keberatan kalau misalnya paparannya juga nanti kami bagikan ke kawan-kawan partisipan?
Boleh.
Baik, terima kasih Bang Afif atas paparannya. Namun dari paparannya Bang Afif kita bisa mendapatkan gambaran tentang bagaimana panjang dan berlikunya proses advokasi bahkan terhadap satu terpidana mati saja. Kawan-kawan jadi bisa bayangkan berapa banyak sumber daya yang sebenarnya tidak perlu dikeluarkan jika saja hukuman mati dihapuskan di berbagai negara, karena hukuman mati merupakan hukuman yang sangat tidak manusiawi, begitu ya. Namun sekali lagi terima kasih Bang Afif atas paparannya. Selanjutnya kita akan mendapatkan kesempatan untuk mendengarkan paparan dari Katrina, Direktur Amnesty International Malaysia. Katrina ini merupakan pembela hak asasi manusia yang sudah bekerja bertahun-tahun untuk membela hak berbagai orang, berbagai individu dan kelompok, terutama di isu-isu migran, pencari suaka, dan orang-orang yang berada di situasi perbudakan. Saat ini Karina sedang memimpin Amnesty International Malaysia yang sedang fokus mengkampanyekan isu-isu tentang kebebasan berekspresi, penghapusan hukuman mati, hak-hak pekerja migran dan pencari suaka, penggunaan kekuatan yang berlebihan oleh aparat keamanan, dan isu-isu lain yang saling berkelindan. Dia lulusan S1 di bidang psikologi dan memiliki gelar master di Applied Human Rights. Tanpa berpanjang lebar, saya ingin memberikan kesempatan untuk Katrina memaparkan paparannya. Katrina, please feel free to start.
Thank you so much, Aldo, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm Katrina, the Executive Director of Amnesty Malaysia. Firstly, I just want to extend my appreciation to Amnesty Indonesia for inviting us to be part of this global launch. I want to thank my colleagues across Amnesty who have been working really hard to pull together this global report and they work on it every year. I also want to thank our esteemed guests, Abang Afif, Dr. Farah, the former MP Kasturi Pato, who will be speaking after me, and also, of course, to journalists in Indonesia and Malaysia, and who may be joining in from elsewhere, and all other guests too. So my presentation today is going to focus on some very historic developments in Malaysia that happened last month, and to give a little bit about what what the bills mean, and also some of the context from our perspective as a organization focused on public campaigning and advocacy. And my fellow panelists will provide their insight as former lawmakers, as academics and leaders within the human rights institutions. I also, yes, that's sort of the context, and I'm going to share my screen. So if you just bear with me for just one moment. Okay, so I think just before I begin, I trust that it looks okay. I want to reflect a little bit on what Abang Afif was saying about, or Aldo's reflections on just how challenging and difficult it is to advocate for cases. Even just one case takes years and years, and sometimes the outcomes are uncertain, and then they continue. Sometimes they happen without us really understanding what led to that outcome, and in other times we are unsuccessful. And I think, just reminding ourselves of this context and what we're doing, and it is the injustices in the system that make it really challenging to do this work. But of course, it's also the impacts on the individual and their families are very real and very severe, and I don't want to leave out all of that emotion, because that is what we're talking about with the death penalty. It's about life, it's about death, it's about torture, it's about trauma, and it's about justice. But the presentation today from my side is also an example of the fact that, good things can happen, that human rights progress is possible. And I think that it's also important to sit with that for a minute and to think about it, because sometimes when you're campaigning for an individual, or you're campaigning to change laws over decades, over years, it can seem really impossible. And in Malaysia, the fight is definitely not over. But last month in April, there was a very significant step forward that we took as a country. And what had happened is that Parliament has passed bills to abolish the mandatory death penalty, and also remove natural life imprisonment, and also create an avenue, a platform for individuals currently on death row to have their cases reviewed. So as you can see sort of on the slide, what does this mean? It means that in Malaysia, prior to last month, the mandatory death penalty was on the books for 11 offenses. And this means that the judges did not have discretion. They could not take into account the full picture of the individual's case, the implications, or sort of the conditions that they may have committed an offense, and so that tied the judges' hands. It also means that really justice was not meted, and so the removal of the mandatory death penalty incredibly significant. The bills also now include alternatives to the death penalty, and unfortunately, some of the alternatives proposed is whipping and life imprisonment between 30 to 40 years. And so as Amnesty, we of course oppose whipping, because whipping is another form of torture. It's a form of cruel and unusual punishment. And so within this context, we have a situation where the mandatory death penalty has been removed. It has been abolished completely for 7 offenses, primarily related to offenses where death is not the outcome, so it doesn't result in death. And the death penalty is still an option for offenses where the offense results in death. But there are also two other offenses where the death penalty is still an option, and that is waging war against the king and also trafficking in dangerous drugs. And of course, Amnesty opposes the death penalty under all circumstances, but especially when it comes to drug offenses, the death penalty that does not meet the threshold of most serious crimes, and so the death penalty should not be even an option in those cases. What are the implications from the bills? So I mentioned that the bills also give powers now for the federal court to review the cases of individuals on death row. There are currently over 1,300 people who are on death row, and now they will have an opportunity to file an appeal to review their sentence. And what this means is that it's not to review the conviction, but the court will have the power to take into account other sort of circumstances and decide if the death penalty sort of remains as a punishment or one of the alternatives. There's a lot more that we need to understand about this resentencing process. We understand that they will have 90 days from when the bills come into effect to file their applications, which is not a very long time at all, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, sort of the other significant thing is that now the judges have discretion to use the death penalty. So thinking about, how do we get here? This is from a perspective of policy, a snapshot of some of the key developments. And as you can see, even just from 2006, so we are about 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, sort of the Malaysian bar took a resolution to announce its commitment to abolishing the death penalty, and the Malaysian Human Rights Commission, Suhakam, also started to advocate for the abolition of the death penalty. And that sort of, as from these two key institutions taking that leadership position, we have then the reforms in 2017, which allowed for some discretion for those convicted of drug trafficking. There were also some key cases in 2017 where there were last-minute commutations of their sentences, or individuals who avoided executions, but this was done in quite a secretive process. There's not a lot of information or understanding as to how that came about. But it also was a result of a lot of public campaigning that Amnesty and others initiated. In 2017, Amnesty also started campaigning for Huiwa, and it's a campaign that we continue until today, and has really led to thousands of people writing in support of him. In 2018 is one of the most significant pieces of work in the then government and in the leadership that they took to really push strongly for death penalty reforms, in particular of the former law minister, the late Liew Wee Kiong, who had really made a commitment to abolish the death penalty, the mandatory death penalty. And the government also then accepted sort of recommendations to the UPR cycle, so responding to international attention and pressure to fully abolish the death penalty. In 2019, another sort of very significant key piece of work, and that was the special committee that was formed to look into the death penalty, the mandatory death penalty, to study how it's been implemented and to look at alternatives. And this was a huge exercise that they undertook with town halls and consultations, and the findings of that really were quite key in leading us to where we are today. In 2019, also Amnesty International published Fatally Flawed, probably one of the most comprehensive reports on the death penalty in Malaysia. And that was that huge piece of research really shaped a lot of the campaigning and advocacy and policy work after. In 2020, Malaysia made a commitment at the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly, committing to a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. And we've had a moratorium on executions since 2018. The work, we've gone through many political ups and downs over the last few years. But in 2022, despite changes in government, there was another really firm commitment made by the then law minister to abolish the mandatory death penalty. And this piece of work came into fruition and was fulfilled despite the changes of government and under the new administration this year. But I also want to point out that, that policy picture is just one framing, very significant, but it is not a complete history. The work has really been going on for decades prior. Arguably, it's really, first and foremost, people on death row and their families and their loved ones who have been doing the very emotionally difficult and painful work of telling their stories and making visible really the effects of this incredibly cruel system. And the families who've been organizing, who've been reaching out to NGO networks and lawmakers have shaped, fundamentally, really, the understanding of the death penalty. And that work, of course, with academics, with researchers, with other activists, and just its steady engagement with the public, even when it was an incredibly unpopular issue to talk about. And so everything from debates to theater to exhibition booths, and just creating lots of opportunities for people to think about the death penalty and to think about what they feel and understand about it, and to perhaps then take action to support people on death penalty or to push their lawmakers. I think the networks of solidarity and urgent appeals and learning circles and discussions, all of that has been absolutely fundamental in leading us to an environment where it was even possible to abolish the mandatory death penalty. And this work is going to be still very crucial for us to continue and fulfill this journey of ending the death penalty in totality. Just to share a couple of...
Katrina, I apologize for interrupting, but the time allocated for your presentation is up.
Okay. Can I just go through the slides on what happens next really quickly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So just to say, to sort of summarize, and we can speak about this a bit later. So the bills have been passed, but now they're waiting to be gazetted. We are really needing to make sure that the resentencing process is fair, and that people will get the legal aid they need in order to put forth a really strong sort of case and ensure that they're right to fair trial. Malaysia has to maintain the moratorium on executions until the death penalty is fully abolished. And we will work towards, removing whipping because that, cruel, inhumane punishment needs to be done with too. And so I will stop here, and I think my fellow panelists will pick up the rest of the picture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Jadi kawan-kawan, dari paparan Katrina tadi, kita bisa melihat bahwa terdapat kemajuan di Malaysia tentang bagaimana pidana mati dihapuskan sebagai pidana pokok dalam 11 tindak pidana. Namun kemajuan itu pun belum cukup karena agenda penghapusan hukuman mati total masih panjang. Namun dari paparan Katrina kita bisa belajar bahwa upaya ini juga harus didukung oleh komitmen dari negara dan lembaga-lembaganya untuk menghapuskan atau mengambil langkah menuju penghapusan hukuman mati. Sekali lagi terima kasih untuk Katrina atas paparannya. Nanti bagi kawan-kawan yang ingin bertanya lebih lanjut tentang situasi di Malaysia dan bagaimana Amnesty International Malaysia mengadvokasikan penghapusan hukuman mati dapat ditanyakan di sesi tanya jawab. Selanjutnya, pembicara kita adalah tamu kehormatan kita dari Suhakam Malaysia. Beliau adalah Dr. Farah Nini Dusuki, komisioner anak Suhakam, yang memiliki pengalaman kurang lebih 30 tahun di area hak asasi manusia dan peraturan perundang-undangan tentang hak-hak anak. Beliau memiliki gelar doktor dari Cardiff University, Wales, di tahun 2002 dengan disertasi yang menganalisa social legal issues dalam perlindungan anak. Tanpa berpanjang lebar, saya ingin memanggil Dr. Farah untuk memaparkan temuannya tentang kondisi situasi hukuman mati di Indonesia. Dr. Farah, you are invited to address the audience.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, Doctor.
Okay, great. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera kepada semua. Very good afternoon to all. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Terima kasih Bapak Aldo di atas introduction yang very kind to me. Just to give a little brief introduction, actually, I am the recently appointed Children's Commissioner, but I believe my capacity to speak in this topic is because of my involvement in the criminal justice since 1993 or 1992, sorry. And I was part of the special committee to study, to look into the alternative punishment upon the abolition of the mandatory death sentence. So what I will be sharing, and I'm very thankful to Katrina for her sharing earlier, so it saves me from having to explain some of the things that I intended to. But the topic that I have actually adopted for this presentation is the Malaysia's path towards the abolition of mandatory death sentence, public sentiment against political will. Because one of the main obstacles to the total abolition of death penalty has always been public sentiment against it, retentionist against abolitionists. So that is why my presentation will be focused on looking at political will and how it has moved and giving some background on what the studies have actually found on public sentiment. My slides can be seen, right? Yes, hang on, just let me change it to slides. Okay. Now, the current state of matter, as I think Katrina has mentioned, this we still have, as of October 2019, 1,275 inmates have been sentenced to death, including 24 who had failed in their appeals and pardon, and all have been given moratorium. And for the record, 33 were executed from 2010 until now. And about political will, I believe, looking at the trail of efforts towards abolition of death penalty, I think publicly and political sphere, in 2010, the former de facto law minister, Datuk Sri Muhammad Nazri Aziz, he had publicly stated that death penalty is not suitable to Malaysia, and the government recognized that Malaysia had an imperfect justice system since there was a high risk of miscarriages of justice. And there have also been studies since then and to look into the efficacy of laws relating to the death sentence. So efforts on serious consideration on the issue have at least going by documentary evidence on studies conducted since 2013. Now, why I want to share this is because in any effort, particularly statutory reform, I believe having cogent and evidence-based findings are very important to back up whatever efforts that we want to undertake. So the first one was published in 2013, and the title was, and I call this the first study, the death penalty in Malaysia, public opinion on the abolition of the mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking and firearm offences. Now, this is the first study. It looks into the public opinion. And the second report, which we call the second study, is the death penalty in Malaysia and the way forward. This is a review on the death penalty laws in Malaysia. And now both studies were done and conducted by the late Emeritus Professor Roger Hood, whom I know I would say the leading authority on this subject matter. So he was the one who conducted these two studies. Now, moving forward on political will, abolishing the mandatory death sentence was in the manifesto of the Pakatan Harapan government in 2018 when they took over, and the effort was pursued by the current government, which led to the recent abolition of the mandatory death penalty in last April 2023. Now, it has been shown that the ineffectiveness of the death penalty as a deterrent was initially recognized in the amendment to the Dangerous Drugs Act, because initially we had the mandatory death sentence for drug trafficking, but that was removed before the current what was happening just recently. This was removed first earlier. The then minister, Datuk Sri Aziz, said that this is a baby step towards the eventual total abolition of the death penalty. So you see, there has been a rather consistent political will since 2010. So on public sentiment, 2013 was the one that provided evidence on how Malaysian actually responded to this issue, and it found that generally support for the death penalty had increased when they were shown actual case scenarios. So let me just give you an example. Yeah, this survey was done, and initially it was done, and the representative sample was 1,535 Malaysian citizens. So in theory, a large majority say that they were, they were in support of the death penalty, whether mandatory or discretionary. Okay. However, all right, when they were given, so this was the findings, all right, for offences of murder, for example, 91% was in support of both mandatory and discretionary death penalty. But for mandatory death penalty, 56% were in support of it. Now, this was the initial findings, okay, when they were asked on the general opinion with regards on their acceptance and reception of the death penalty. But when we were to look at, when the study looked at the level of support in theory versus reality, so theory was the initial finding, you saw the statistics just now, but when asked to say what sentences they would themselves impose on a series of scenario cases, all of which were subject to a mandatory death sentence, there was a large gap that was found between the level of support in theory and the level of support when faced with the reality. Reality means they were given actual case scenario, and then they were asked if they had to judge on the particular matter, would they be giving, death penalty. So for none of the 4 scenario drug trafficking cases, more than 30% chose the death penalty, even when one case involved smuggling of 25 kilograms of heroin. Only 8% chose death for all the scenario cases they judged. So you can see, if you compare with the theoretical finding earlier, the percentage has gone down significantly. Regarding the 6 murder scenarios, a majority chose death for only 3 of the cases, and the highest proportion being 65% for a recidivist robber. Of the 56% who said they favored the mandatory death penalty for murder, whatever the circumstances, only 14% of them actually chose the death penalty for all the case scenarios which they judged. And this was only 8% of the total number of respondents. So if you were to go back to the earlier finding, do you call this one the theoretical one, when they were asked whether they would support, death penalty for murder, drug trafficking, firearms? Comparatively, theoretically, it was higher, a lot higher. But when they were given the actual case scenarios to decide, then the percentages went significantly lower. You see? So when judging, for example, 2 scenarios where a firearm had been discharged during a burglary, only 20% chose death in the most serious case, where the person fired had been wounded. Only 1.2% in 100 thought that the death penalty was the appropriate punishment for all 12 scenario cases. Drug trafficking, of murder, drug trafficking, and firearm offences that were judged showing decisively that the vast majority favoured a discretionary use of the death penalty. So you see, I mean, this is evidence-based that when you actually gave the case scenarios, many opted for discretionary use rather than what was popularly thought that, you know, people would want to go for the mandatory death sentence. And the main reason why people chose when they were asked the death sentence was retribution, and when against it, they said it would be a disproportionate punishment. And deterrence was mentioned by no more than 15%. Okay? When they were asked whether they would support the death penalty if it were proven that innocent persons had been executed, the proportion in favor for murder fell to 33%, for drug trafficking to 26%, and to 23% for firearm offences. So the second study was commissioned by the government through the former Attorney General, and this was called the ICEL study. And at the study's conclusion in 2016, ICELs recommended to the cabinet the total abolition of the death penalty in Malaysia. So the government had actually supported two important studies which now led to the abolition of the mandatory death sentence. However, the government's effort did not stop there. You know, there was earlier two studies. Subsequently, a cabinet decision was undertaken, you know, between 5th July 2019 to 29th August 2019, whereby, to cut the long story short, the cabinet approved the setting up of a special committee to study and recommend alternative sentences to replace the mandatory death penalty upon their decision earlier on the 12th July that they want to abolish the mandatory death sentence involving 9 offences under the Penal Code and 2 offences under the Firearms Increased Penalty Act that carry the mandatory death sentences. So 11 sentences of mandatory death sentence. And these are the details of the death sentence, the offences that carry the mandatory death sentence, and the scope and the parameters of the study for the special committee was that to look for the alternative sentencing for 11 offences that carry the mandatory death penalty, and the offence to see the earlier offence I mentioned earlier on drug trafficking, because although the mandatory death sentence was removed, 4 conditions were added as you know prior to the imposition of death penalty, and the 4 conditions are really hard to fulfill. So that's why that also was looked at. And the study also looked at the effect of 21 other offences which carry the discretionary death penalty. Thirdly, the effect on other less serious offences that carry serious penalties compared to offences that carry the death penalty, because you have to be proportionate, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to give alternative sentences which are actually lesser than the punishment given for serious other offences that do not carry the death penalty. And fourthly, the effect when the moratorium is lifted on the death row prisoners and the prisoners among them who have exhausted all avenues of appeal in the pardon process. So the composition of the special committee that was appointed by the Prime Minister consists of 9 experts from various fields. There was a former Chief Justice, there was a former Chief Judge of Malaya, former Court of Appeal Judge, former Solicitor General, former government officials, legal practitioners, there were 2 of them, a criminologist and academician, 2 academicians including myself. So the duration was actually 3 months. We did actually got an extension of 1 month to present the report, and the committee was assisted by 4 research officers. It was really, it was quite a strenuous exercise because it was 4 months of conducting a very intensive study. Okay, so this was the core: to study and review the existing sentencing policy, to study and review the implications of the moratorium with the implementation of the abolition, and to conduct stakeholder consultations to obtain views from all parties at all levels, and to, of course, analyze the findings and provide recommendations to the government. So these were what took place during the 4 months, or rather 3 months, and the final month was spent writing up the report. We conducted town hall sessions according to region, and also members of parliament, both opposition and government. We also conducted expert opinion and conducted focus group, obtained expert opinions from abroad and domestically, and also conducted focus group discussion with experts. And there was also online public consultations of total of 6,284 completed online questionnaires. And in the final labs, we had meetings with the victim's family, the family of death row prisoners, and also the death row inmates themselves at the prison. So I would say that, you know, the consultations were rather extensive and done pretty intensively. And
Dr.
benchmarking,
Farah, my
yes.
apologies for interrupting, but
Okay.
your time is up already.
Can I conclude at least?
Yes,
Because
please.
it's important to sort of like, you know, tie into what happens now, yeah? And benchmarking was also done to learn from other jurisdiction. And I'm going to step in. So the situation now, as you all know, we have already abolished, and you know, it was recently passed by the House of Commons and Senate. And currently, we are waiting for the actual date of enforcement of these laws, and of course for the government to develop standard operating procedures and guidelines and procedures on what to do with the 1,315, you know, those who are now on moratorium. So way forward would be advocacy. Studies must be done. It has to be cogent. It has to, you know, it has to be evidence-based. And it's very important to have sharing of these findings. Engagements with political and community leaders and also stakeholders to really share the findings of this study as what was done by the special committee. And of course, education, public awareness programs on all levels of society. So on that score, thank you very much for the invitation again. I welcome if there are any time for, is there any time for a question and answer session?
Thank you very much, Dr. Farah, for your presentation. We really appreciate it. Kawan-kawan, tadi dari Dr. Farah kita mendengarkan temuan-temuan yang sangat menarik, utamanya tentang bagaimana sentimen publik itu berbeda di level teoritis, dan ketika mereka diberikan skenario nyata untuk quote-unquote menghakimi sebuah kasus begitu ya, terkait penggunaan hukuman mati. Dan saya rasa ini bisa menjadi salah satu inspirasi bagi kami kawan-kawan di Indonesia maupun di berbagai belahan dunia yang lain untuk menginisiasi studi serupa, setidaknya untuk mengedepankan agenda evidence-based campaigning atau kampanye berbasis bukti gitu ya, berbasis studi. Juga dari paparan Dr. Farah kita bisa mendalami poin-poin yang tadi disampaikan sebelumnya oleh Katrina tentang juga bagaimana harus ada keinginan politik dari negara untuk mengambil langkah menuju penghapusan hukuman mati yang menyeluruh. Pembicara terakhir kita adalah mantan anggota parlemen di Malaysia, Kasturi Pato, yang kini menjabat sebagai Deputy International Secretary for the International Affairs Department di partainya Democratic Action Party. Dia menjabat sebagai anggota parlemen 2 kali, dan Kasturi juga merupakan mantan President of Parliamentarians for Global Action, yang merupakan koalisi lebih dari 1.200 perumus kebijakan dari parlemen yang dipilih secara demokratis. Tanpa berpanjang lebar, saya ingin memberikan waktu dan kesempatan kepada Kasturi yang sudah hadir bersama kita hari ini. Kasturi, please feel free to start.
Terima kasih Aldo, dan kepada Amnesty International Indonesia, Amnesty International Malaysia dan semua rakan-rakan sejawat termasuk Suhakam dari Malaysia dan juga rakan-rakan online. Saya teruskan dalam bahasa Malaysia atau bahasa Inggeris?
You could continue speaking in the language that you prefer, Kasturi, because we have both BM interpreter and English, as well as Bahasa Indonesia interpreter.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm sure you've already been enlightened with the important sharings by the previous panelists, all the work, the good work that they have done in their campaign in their own countries or in the region to see their country, their homeland free of the death penalty. I am a two-term MP, as what Aldo had mentioned. And I started campaigning to abolish the death penalty in Malaysia when I became an MP in 2013. So this is 10 years of campaign. And you see a small success that we have one foot in the door today with the abolition of the mandatory death penalty. But it wasn't easy. When I first started off campaigning about it, it was just maybe me and just a handful of other MPs. And it wasn't a subject that many MPs would want to take on as well. I understand that from when I discussed with my other fellow members of parliament in Malaysia, whether they were from the government or the opposition, the viewpoint was that it is not a bread and butter issue. It's not an economic issue. It's not that important. So let's deal with the other issues first, the cost of living, high prices, and just trying to put food on the table, etc. But I must also give credit where it was due, that the first person who reached out to me on an imminent execution in Malaysia was the former executive director of Amnesty International, Shamini Darshni. And from there, my campaign began. It wasn't easy. Even at that time, there were 3 men who were going to be executed in Malaysia, and the family only found out about it a few days before the execution. So in Malaysia, executions happen on Fridays and by virtue of hanging. And this time we found out that in order for the case not to attract a lot of international attention, domestic attention, or pressure by NGOs, the government gave a very short period to the family to prepare to claim their loved ones after the execution. That case hit me quite hard. But for me, the turning point was when I attended the candlelight vigil in Kajang prison. And this was in 2015 or 2016. And it was the Batu Malay brothers. 2 brothers in the same family were charged with murder. And the punishment was execution. And we had a candlelight vigil because their case was in the Pardons Board of Negeri Sembilan, and we were waiting for an answer from the Pardons Board. If the Pardons Board agreed not to intervene for a stay of execution. However, we also found it was strange because it appeared that both these men were going to be executed on a Wednesday. And this is not something that was common in Malaysia. So it was a very hasty, very, speeded execution. But what struck me very hard was that when I was standing at night, it was raining outside Kajang prison. And I looked at the family members of the Batu Malay brothers. The mother was a rubber tapper. She was poor, evidently, standing there with her blouse and her sarong, with a good morning towel on her shoulder, crying as she was wiping her tears under the rain. I looked at all the other family members, and I looked at all the cars that were parked by the roadside heading up to the prison. And what I saw were not BMWs or Volvos, Mercedes-Benz, Pajeros, expensive cars. I saw Malaysian-made cars. I saw cars that were not of that range, And it hit me so hard because you would never see a person dressed up in a suit or an expensive attire standing by the roadside appealing to the government not to execute their children. And it hit me hard because the law is not applied equally for everyone. That if you have privilege, you have power, you have connection in high places, then very likely, as we know, not all legal systems are perfect. No criminal justice system is perfect, that you could walk away. You might get a slap on the wrist, but very likely not the death penalty. And it hit me hard also because that I found that the application of the law, particularly when it concerned the death penalty, was on your regular men and women, your warga marhain, as you call it. How many times did we hear of a child of a minister or a relative of someone holding a very high position in government being charged with a crime that warrants the death penalty? And statistically in Malaysia, more than 86% of people on death row come from a lower economic group. And this shows that you can't talk about the death penalty without talking about economy. You can't talk about the death penalty without talking about social justice. And time again, you find that surveys, polls conducted by the media, and many times media are not tuned or conditioned to ask the right type of questions anyway. You can't ask a question about the death penalty as in an A or B, black or white question. Do you support it? Yes or no? You have to give circumstances, because that's what death penalty cases are about. It's about the circumstances of the person. Nobody wants to commit a crime that warrants the death penalty. Nobody would think that if by committing this, that they would face the death sentence. So when you find that the application of the law can be lopsided, and come on, we all saw how easily laws could be manipulated, particularly during COVID. Whether it is in the case of prime ministers who have parties during COVID, or ministers or deputy ministers or people in higher positions who are let off the hook when they breached COVID lockdown rules. And you find that the application is not the same for people. People have to go through the entire thing. You have to pay the price for it. So to me, my aim is to see a Malaysia free of the death penalty. But as an MP, I also realized that many MPs choose not to speak about it because they find it difficult for them to explain to their constituents why they took this stand. I found it difficult as well in my term, my 2 terms as an MP, to talk to my constituents and tell them why I believed in it, why I believed in a Malaysia without the death penalty. Now, let's be very clear here. Fighting to abolish the death penalty does not mean, however, that we are soft on crime. In the case of Malaysia, many times the issue of the death penalty has been spun to say, oh, in that case, you will see criminals in the street, terrorists in the street, murderers in the street. I want a safe country too. I want a safe environment for my family, for my mother, for my constituents. I believe that if you commit a crime, you must be punished for it. I just don't believe the death penalty is the punishment for crime committed. Having said that, I believe that, like what I heard Katrina mention, Dr. Farah mention, it takes a lot of political will as well. I have seen 4 prime ministers come and go in my 10-year term fighting for the death penalty. And it took this government, a government that I believe has a moral conscience, to say that Malaysia is better off without having a mandatory death penalty. The numbers of people on death row has increased. When I became an MP, it was just 900 plus. Today, we're looking at over 1,300 people in Malaysia on death row. And I think it's one of the highest in the world. It's nothing to be proud of. And similarly, Indonesia now as the chair of ASEAN, Malaysia sitting as a member of the UN Human Rights Council. I think there's much that we can do to inspire each other, for us to create and build bridges amongst each other, while we are on the same page that we want to fight the drug menace. And let's not also forget whatever is happening in Myanmar right now with the junta in power has led to the circulation of more drugs. Now, we may not see it, but it is evident given porous borders as well in ASEAN. It's something that we need to work on. And at the end of the day, it is a drug muse, it is your regular Ahmad, your regular Raju, your regular Achong, who are going to be the ones who are going to face the music at the end of the day. I think that in ASEAN, while we are committed in the name of national security to ensure that we have safe borders, to ensure we have safe countries, we cannot neglect our obligation to also ensure that we are defenders of human rights and to ensure that the voices of the marginalized, the minority, don't go unheard just because that we are chasing this trend to ensure that we fight crime tough. So I think that we both have unique platforms to work on, and I look forward to foster this relationship between NGOs, NGIs in Indonesia and in Malaysia. And I certainly hope that what happened in Malaysia with the abolition of the mandatory death penalty today, it is not merely an abolition on paper, but it shows that with that, the government must also change its way of looking at how cases are investigated, how documentations need to be improved. There has to be a reform in the police system as well. You can't just say, oh, we abolished the mandatory death penalty and expect a miracle to happen and crime to drop. It's a collective responsibility by everyone. It is by the police. You have to also fight corruption. You have to fight racial profiling, which is something that is quite common in Malaysia as well. You have to also ensure that you have a transparent means of investigation, transparent means of submitting evidence, etc., taking evidence from whistleblowers, for example. That has to be a great deal of transparency in that case. So I hope that we'll be able to, our two parliaments, the Malaysian Parliament and the Indonesian Parliament, can come together on the same page. And before I end, I also must thank parliamentarians for global action who have been a formidable partner with the Malaysian Parliament and MPs. I remember coming to Jakarta a few years ago as well. And just to recap, Philippines was on its way to amend its federal constitution to bring back the death penalty. And myself and a former MP from Cambodia, Mu Suchwa, she's in exile now, we both flew to Manila to tell Philippines, please don't do this. If Philippines brings back the death penalty, it will have a disastrous spillover effect in the region, in ASEAN. After that, I was in Jakarta and we met up with former judges, we met up with MPs in the commission, in the parliament, we met up with the NGOs to talk about how the death penalty has not reduced crime in Indonesia. And it's often used as a political fodder for candidates to say, if I win, I will bring back. If I win, I will abolish. You know, at the end of the day, you want to be able to create a system in a country that is fair, just, and laws that are applied the same way for everyone, not just differently for the privileged, for the powerful, and those with high connections and cables. So with that, I thank you so much, and I look forward to questions and a fruitful discussion after this. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Kasturi. Dari paparan Kasturi, kita bisa lihat bagaimana penggunaan hukuman mati di Malaysia pun cukup diskriminatif gitu ya. Dia pilih-pilih. Tadi kalau misalnya mengutip ceritanya Kasturi, orang-orang yang berjas dan berdasi akan sangat sulit ditemukan sedang meminta pemerintah untuk tidak menerapkan hukuman mati. Ini juga menggambarkan problem yang sangat serius tentang bagaimana hukuman mati pun juga dipenuhi dengan elemen-elemen yang sifatnya politis dan terkait dengan kekuasaan. Begitu ya. Sekali lagi terima kasih Kasturi atas paparan yang sangat menarik tadi. Sekarang kita akan memasuki sesi tanya-jawab. Kawan-kawan sekalian, terima kasih atas pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang sudah masuk. Mekanismenya, demi memudahkan proses interpretasi bahasa, saya akan mendahulukan pertanyaan yang ditujukan kepada pembicara dari Indonesia. Setelah itu, baru saya akan move on ke pertanyaan yang ditujukan bagi pembicara Indonesia dan Malaysia. Baru yang terakhir, saya akan masuk ke pertanyaan yang khusus diadres untuk pembicara kita dari Malaysia. Sehingga di awal nanti akan ada proses translasi dari bahasa Indonesia, translasi jawaban dari bahasa Indonesia ke bahasa Inggris. Kemudian nanti ada 2, baru yang terakhir kita akan full menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Begitu ya kawan-kawan. Untuk pertanyaan pertama, dan sebelum saya menuju ke pertanyaan ini, saya akan memberikan alokasi waktu sekitar 2 menit bagi setiap pembicara untuk menjawab pertanyaan yang diberikan. Nanti jika misalnya dirasa kurang atau apa, kita bisa tambah, tapi bergantung pada sisa waktu yang kita miliki. Begitu ya kawan-kawan? Oke. Pertanyaan pertama, ini dalam bahasa Indonesia dan untuk pembicara bahasa Indonesia. Mengapa hukuman mati untuk terpidana narkoba perlu dihapus? Bukannya ada potensi mereka akan tetap menjadi pengedar jika dibiarkan bebas atau hidup di balik penjara. Apakah adil untuk masyarakat yang menjadi korban? Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua, untuk Indonesia, jika tidak pidana mati, apa alternatifnya? Sementara masyarakat banyak tidak percaya pada penegak hukum termasuk kepala lapas. Untuk Bang Afif dan Mas Ari, apakah pertanyaannya cukup jelas atau harus saya ulang?
Jelas.
Cukup jelas ya, baik. Saya akan berikan waktu kepada Bang Afif dulu kali ya, baru nanti ke Ari jika ingin menambahkan.
Oke.
Silakan Bang Afif, waktunya 2 menit, Pak.
Oke, terima kasih Bung Aldo. Jadi terkait dengan apa alternatif selain pidana mati, nah saya pikir justru itu pertanyaan yang menarik untuk kita diskusikan karena kita sudah mulai beranjak untuk tidak menggunakan hukuman mati untuk kejahatan apapun dan siapapun pelakunya. Nah, karena kami melihat bahwa hukuman mati ini memiliki banyak problem baik dari sisi regulasi dan juga implementasinya. Nah, tadi kita melihat bahwa opini publik mendorong penghapusan mati dengan beberapa skenario yang tentu sangat bervariasi. Nah, kita juga pada saat 2 tahunan yang lalu itu hampir serupa penelitian tersebut. Kita mengcapture opini publik di Indonesia ketika ditanya soal apakah masih ingin menggunakan hukuman mati. Nah, ketika disodorkan beberapa pertanyaan yang berkaitan dengan problematika hukuman mati, maka pilihan terhadap hukuman mati itu berkurang sehingga dukungan publik terhadap penerapan hukuman mati itu menjadi berkurang. Nah, saya pikir sebagai negara hukum yang demokratis penting untuk mempertimbangkan opini tersebut dan itu saya pikir kebijakan yang dipilih sebagaimana tadi Bung Aldo sampaikan kebijakan yang berbasis bukti. Nah, dibanding saat ini yang mungkin cenderung mengandalkan emosi publik dan juga kepentingan elektoral. Nah, ini pun juga kami catat di selama pemerintahan Jokowi, kalau misalnya kita lihat sejak dilantik bulan Oktober tahun 2014, itu awal dilantik tidak kurang dari setahun, sudah deklarasi untuk menolak gerasi terpidana mati dan akan melakukan eksekusi mati yang mungkin kita catat sangat ekstrim di setiap pemerintahan presiden yang ada di Indonesia. Karena kesan gagah dan berani seperti ingin dimunculkan. Namun sayangnya ternyata itu keliru karena hukum yang ditetapkan itu tidak berdasarkan tujuan sebagaimana hukum itu sendiri. Nah, eksekusi pertama kalau kita misalnya lihat itu kan menyasar 2 perempuan, ada Rani Andriani dan juga Tebi Chan dari Vietnam. Nah, di antaranya dalam posisi yang sangat rentan karena dijebak dan juga masuk dalam jaringan sindikat dan juga memiliki background ekonomi yang sangat miskin. Nah, ini yang tidak masuk dalam pertimbangan mereka untuk tidak dieksekusi. Namun sayangnya negara melakukan eksekusi terhadap 2 perempuan terpidana mati tersebut. Nah, serupa di eksekusi gelombang kedua, meskipun ditunda sampai dengan batas waktu yang tidak ditentukan, MGV yang 2 jam mungkin kalau tidak ada yang membisiki presiden, dia udah bisa bisa dieksekusi. Namun kan kalau kita lihat backgroundnya sehari sebelum eksekusi ada Sergio dan Christina yang menyerahkan diri di Filipina. Nah, tentu ini menguntungkan karena eksekusinya batal. Tapi dalam kasusnya MGV ini penting, makanya kasusnya MGV ketika dilihat bahwa ada problem jaringan sindikat yang mengiming-imingi korbannya untuk masuk ke dalam peredaran gelap narkotika, itu sayangnya tidak dipertimbangkan dan hukum Indonesia tumpul untuk mempertimbangkan hal itu karena melihat crime narkotika hanya ansih narkotika saja, sementara background di luar dari kasus narkotikanya mungkin mereka tidak melihatnya. Nah, ini yang patut disayangkan karena regulasi kita pun juga tidak memberikan kesempatan bagi hakim untuk mempertimbangkan hal itu. Makanya kalau kita lihat putusan-putusan pengadilannya sama sekali tidak beranjak kepada pembuktian apakah dia dijebak ataupun sebagai korban. Termasuk Merri Utami juga yang tidak mempertimbangkan bagaimana dia dijebaknya. Nah, terakhir
Bang Afif, mohon maaf waktunya sudah habis.
Oke, siap.
Untuk menjawab, saya akan memberi bagi tambahan konteks sedikit ketika Bang Afif tadi menyebutkan MJV, artinya Mary Jane Veloso, bagi kawan-kawan yang kurang familiar dengan isu ini. Silakan kepada Mas Ari.
Oke, makasih.
Waktunya sama 2 menit.
Bung Aldo, tadi Mas Afif sebenarnya udah menjelaskan cukup banyak ya, jadi mungkin aku tinggal nambahin sedikit aja. Yang perlu dipahami adalah kemudian hukuman mati itu tidak menyelesaikan akar permasalahan atau masalah utama dari kejahatan terkait narkotika. Apalagi kalau sampai, apalagi anggapannya untuk menimbulkan efek jera. Anggapan ini tuh didasari atau tanpa didasari, untuk kebijakan rasional berbasis bukti. Tadi Bang Afif sudah bilang, evidence-based policy. Kalau kita lihat angka narkotika ini kan sekarang 94%. Yang divonis mati banyak. Tapi saya ingat pernyataan Kepala BNN di Februari 2022 lalu, Komjen Golose, dia bilang kalau prevalensi pengguna narkotika di Indonesia itu justru mengalami peningkatan. Tahun 2021 itu menjadi 3,66 juta jiwa. Yang mana tahun 2019 itu 3,41 juta jiwa. Nah, kalau kita lihat dari pernyataan BNN ini aja, itu sudah menunjukkan bahwa asumsi untuk menimbulkan efek jera itu, setidaknya untuk kasus narkotika ya, itu menjadi tidak terbukti. Gitu. Nah, di berbagai negara, kejahatan terkait narkotika ini memang sudah dipandang sebagai masalah sistemik. Itu di dalamnya ada kesenjangan sosial, ekonomi, kesehatan masyarakat, ada orang yang terpaksa kemudian menjual narkotika karena kesulitan membiayai hidup mereka. Nah, dalam konteks internasional, juru bicara UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, tahun 2019 lalu itu udah menyatakan bahwa Konvensi Internasional tentang kontrol terhadap narkotika, yang merupakan cikal bakal dari sistem pengendalian narkotika di setiap negara ya, termasuk di Indonesia nih, itu nggak bisa dijadikan justifikasi untuk penggunaan pidana mati bagi tindak pidana yang berkaitan dengan narkotika. Jadi UNODC aja, ini badan UN sendiri yang fokus di isu narkotika ini, itu sudah menyatakan hal demikian. Jadi bahkan menyatakan bahwa penerapan pidana mati itu justru akan menghalangi kerjasama internasional untuk memberantas peredaran gelap narkotika. Jadi hukuman mati untuk narkotika itu sangat kontraproduktif. Bukan jalan pintas untuk menyelesaikan masalah. Terus tadi Sheila sempat tanya juga ya kalau nggak salah ya, apakah adil kemudian bagi masyarakat yang menjadi korban? Juga harus dipahami bahwa hukuman mati itu merupakan bentuk penyiksaan. Artinya, nantinya kalau dibiarkan secara terus-menerus, implementasinya juga akan terus menimbulkan ketidakadilan bagi keluarga pelakunya nanti yang dihukum mati. Jadi, ibaratnya kalau boleh dibilang sampai kapan mata kemudian akan dibalas dengan mata lagi gitu. Kalau mata selalu dibalas dengan mata, pada akhirnya kan seluruh dunia nanti akan jadi buta gitu. Nah, apa alternatifnya nih? Alternatifnya yang perlu dipahami, Amnesty itu bukan organisasi yang anti terhadap penghukuman. Jadi apabila ada orang yang memang terbukti melakukan kejahatan, misalnya terkait narkotika, silakan diperiksa secara adil gitu ya, sesuai dengan prinsip fair trial, dan kemudian diberikan sanksi penjara atau mungkin lebih baik lagi rehabilitasi. Rehabilitasi, pemasyarakatan efektif, upaya penghapusan kesenjangan mungkin bisa jadi solusi yang lebih tepat untuk menyelesaikan masalah struktural yang menyebabkan orang kemudian menjadi pengguna narkotika. Jadi kita harus paham dulu bahwa kejahatan narkotika ini banyak sekali background dan latar belakangnya, faktor ekonomi, relasi kuasa untuk pelaku perempuan misalnya. Jadi seperti itu gambarannya. Terus
sorry Pak Ari, ya? Tapi waktunya sudah habis.
Oke.
Tapi jangan khawatir untuk Bang Afif dan Ari, karena Bang Afif dan Ari tetap bisa menuliskan jawaban secara langsung di fitur Q&A yang bisa dilihat di tab di bawah layar kawan-kawan masing-masing. Di situ pertanyaannya ada, silakan bisa diketik jawabannya lebih lanjut gitu ya. Baik.
Oke, thank you, Dok.
Sama-sama. Sekarang saya akan, karena tadi sejauh ini cuman itu saja pertanyaan untuk pembicara Indonesia, sekarang saya akan move on ke sebuah pertanyaan yang ditujukan bagi pembicara dari kedua negara, dari Indonesia dan Malaysia. Ini ada There's a question from Heather Chen from CNN. The question is, and this is addressed for Amnesty Indonesia and Amnesty Malaysia. So the question is, an unnamed Singaporean man is scheduled to be executed at dawn tomorrow. Noting the release of this joint amnesty report, I would like to hear what Amnesty Malaysia and Indonesia can say about the progress each of your respective countries have made, and what you think about possible rise in executions in Singapore. So that's the first question. The second question is, and what do you hope that the government of Singapore can listen and learn from the progressive developments seen in Malaysia and Indonesia? Are the questions clear enough, or should I repeat them? Yeah, good. Okay. Then allow me to give the floor to Katrina first, and then Ari. Katrina, you have 2 minutes to answer.
Sure. Thanks, Aldo, and thank you for the question, Heather. Yeah, it is very distressing. We received that news. We saw the news yesterday also on this. And, you know, Singapore has recently also executed another individual. And Singapore is just one of 4 countries known to have executed people for drug-related offenses in recent years. And the trend in Singapore really moving in the completely opposite direction from global trends, where the use of the death penalty is reducing executions, and certainly for drug offenses. You know, the justification by Singapore that the death penalty is needed because it's a deterrent is not based in reality. There's no justification for that. There's no sound reasoning for that. Singapore has received strong condemnation globally, and also condemnation from the UN itself, not just for the use of the death penalty, but the use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses. And so, I mean, really, the call to the Singapore government has been loud and clear globally, and we will repeat the call. Singapore has to halt the executions. They have to commute all existing death sentences. And, you know, they definitely must move towards full abolition of the death penalty. But in the interim, they need to bring their domestic legislation in line with international standards. And to the people of Singapore, I think it's also important to understand and to realize that the movement in a more positive, progressive, rights-based direction is absolutely possible. And we need the continued sort of global condemnation of Singapore and other countries that are carrying out these executions. I'll hand it over to Ari now. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Katrina. Untuk selanjutnya saya akan menambahkan jawaban dari Katrina. Ini arah yang cukup negatif ya, berarti dari pemerintah Singapura. Yang mana saat ini tahun 2022 itu ada 11 orang yang dieksekusi, yang mana tahun sebelumnya itu 0, dan 100% atau ke-11-nya ini itu untuk kasus narkotika. Berarti memang pendekatan terhadap narkotika ini masih dianggap menjadi sesuatu yang patut gitu ya, untuk dijatuhi hukuman mati. Dan mana kasus ini juga sama, pemikiran ini juga sama, juga diadopsi oleh pemerintah Indonesia. Yang bisa saya sampaikan adalah berarti banyak negara artinya masih melakukan interpretasi subjektif pasal 6 ayat 2 ICCPR. Nah, kemudian memasukkan kasus narkotika sebagai kejahatan luar biasa atau the most serious crime. Karena di ICCPR itu ada rambu-rambunya untuk negara yang masih memberlakukan hukuman mati, itu harus untuk kejahatan luar biasa, the most serious crime. Dalam komentar umum nomor 36 tentang pasal 6 ini, Komite HAM PBB tahun 2018 itu padahal sudah menyatakan bahwa pemaknaan terminologi kejahatan paling serius, the most serious crimes itu harus dibaca secara ketat. Jadi berhubungan hanya untuk kejahatan dengan konsekuensi ekstrim, menyertakan pembunuhan berdasarkan niat. Kejahatan yang tidak secara langsung menghasilkan atau dilakukan dengan niat untuk mematikan seperti narkotika ini sifatnya bukan merupakan kejahatan serius, maka tidak bisa dijadikan dasar untuk penjatuhan pidana mati. Nah, ini adalah pendekatan yang masih diadopsi oleh negara termasuk Indonesia dan Singapura. Nah, apa yang bisa kita lakukan? Tadi sudah sempat disampaikan bahwa Indonesia saat ini sebagai ketua ASEAN, saya rasa ini bisa menjadi momentum ya untuk kemudian membicarakan terkait perubahan-perubahan untuk kemudian melakukan moratorium dan arahnya untuk penghapusan secara total hukuman mati paling tidak di Indonesia dan di ASEAN untuk negara-negara yang sedang kita bahas saat ini. Gitu. Jadi jangan sampai yang mana sebenarnya presentasinya sangat-sangat besar untuk tindak pidana narkotika ini di Singapura 100%, di Indonesia 93%, ini angka yang sangat mengkhawatirkan. Jadi ini adalah sesuatu yang saya kira harus diperbaiki oleh kedua negara, dan Indonesia saat ini memiliki peran penting di ASEAN, harusnya bisa kemudian membuat sesuatu kerjasama dengan Singapura untuk arah penghapusan hukuman mati ya, baik secara legislasi maupun di prakteknya. Gitu Dok dari terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Bapak Ari, and thank you Katrina for answering the questions. And now I'll move on to the questions that are addressed to our Malaysian panelists only. The first question, I think this one specifically addressed to AI Malaysia. What are AI Malaysia's short-term goals in working towards removing whipping in Malaysia? Katrina also mentioned the complexities of the upcoming resentencing process. How does she see AI Malaysia's role in easing that process?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Firstly, I think the short-term goals really for whipping, I think we have to have a long-term view, because whipping needs to be removed as an option. We cannot have the corporal punishment, infliction of torture on people as a form of justice. And so keeping that long sight in view is really important. In the meantime, the call to the government, to have a moratorium on the use of whipping is needed. And within that space, I think, the public understanding of really what it means when we inflict whipping, and really mobilizing that voice to the government to reflect sort of the rejection of the use of torture is needed. In regards to the resentencing process, firstly, I think Amnesty Malaysia certainly needs to work in concert with a network of organizations, certainly at the foremost family members of people on death row, who really will have the clearest view towards the challenges that their loved ones are facing, the obstacles, and will be able to articulate what are the barriers that need to be overcome. I think needing to work very closely, of course, with the Bar Council and others to make sure that the Malaysian government is being transparent with the resentencing process. So we heard from the other speakers that yes, this once the law is in effect, there's a 90 days, but it's sort of a very broad picture right now, and there needs to be clarity. There also needs to be a lot of pressure to ensure that there's good, robust legal aid services, so that people can put in, meaningful applications. And so right now we're operating with a lot of uncertainty, and I think public campaigning, public awareness, public members of the public asking lawmakers for their direction and leadership is going to continue to be very important in the interim, to address the individuals on death row, whether it's a resentencing, and that momentum must continue throughout this journey of abolition. But I also welcome other panelists if you want to add anything to this question.
Yes, please. If Dr. Farah or Kasturi want to add Katrina's response, please.
I think I want to add something. Is it okay?
Yes, please, Kasturi. You have 2 minutes.
In 2018, when Pakatan Harapan became government, the Minister for Foreign Affairs took it upon himself to be directly involved in Malaysia ratifying the UNCAT, which is the UN Convention Against Torture. And while we were making inroads, the government changed, and there was a coup, and so the whole idea was put on hold. But it has come back again in line, perhaps from last year, when the former Minister of Law, Wan Junaidi, tabled the first reading to abolish the mandatory death penalty. And then we had our elections in November, and the government changed again to what it is today. So the whole perception, view of torture has been spoken about again in Parliament by one MP and supported by a few. I think this is a good opportunity for select committees in Parliament to, particularly those working on international affairs and on human rights, to assist the government in the steps that's needed towards signing and ratifying the UNCAT, and also reviewing the current laws in the country. These are all colonial laws that have been left behind. The death penalty is a colonial law. Caning, this sort of capital punishment, is also corporal punishment. Sorry, is also colonial laws. But again, MPs cannot do it alone. Not all MPs are interested in the subject. Many see it as a punishment that needs to be retained as a form of a deterrent. And you can find that even the mood on social media, depending if you're on Facebook, Twitter, the arguments are slightly different. But what is important is that we talk about it. All the while, Malaysia has had this same government in power for 6 decades, and this whole mindset of government knows best. But today you find that as we are part of a growing global community, that this sort of archaic forms of punishment, which serves no form of deterrent, must slowly make its way out. So I think that, and I think this is something that the Indonesian Parliament and the Malaysian Parliament together can assist each other and support each other, and particularly in the Malaysian context with the select committees. Suhakam has been extremely a formidable partner as well. But this is also important because for many years, the human rights report produced by Suhakam has never been tabled in the Malaysian Parliament. It has only been tabled once. And that was also, because it was a new government. But today, it is not being given the due importance that it deserves. So these are all steps in the right direction to get MPs to understand why it is important not just to talk about holes in the road, potholes and rubbish collection and prices of eggs and clothes and food, etc. Yes, these are all important matters. But then you also, as federal lawmakers, it's important to talk about human rights issues on a global scale as well. So yeah, that's my little sharing on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasturi. Dr. Farah, do you have anything to add, please?
Just a little one in 30 seconds, maybe. I still go back to, evidence-based findings, because you see, it's number one, it's about undertaking the actual study. I strongly recommend that, to conduct such an extensive study. I mean, you can replicate the one that was done by Professor Roger Hood. It was brilliant. And then to disseminate the findings to the public. Because at the end of the day, whilst we feel that, well, most people are retentionists, but when they go to the crunch of it, many are actually not in full favor, you see, when they're really put in the position. So that's why it's so critical that we have evidence-based studies. And that's why Suhakam, as YB Kasturi has rightly put it, the efforts is ongoing. We've never stopped. Anytime you get funding, huge fundings and all that, like the next step would be to do another study on abolition of the remaining, offences that carry the death penalty. See, because we have, the mandatory ones, the 11 ones have already been duly abolished, but now towards the other goal, which is the eventual total abolition. You see, and also the whipping. And never give up, because 10 years ago, frankly, as a criminal justice academic, I wouldn't have imagined we would be, doing away with 2 major sentences. Number one, mandatory death sentence, and the other one, natural life imprisonment. This second one, we always think that, people don't think about it and all that. But then, again, with the findings of the earlier research and with the findings of the special committee, we advocated the two abolition. And fortunately, after educating the MPs as well, it went successfully through the readings.
Thank you, Dr. Farah and Kasturi. Now I'm going to move on to the next question, which is again addressed exclusively to our Malaysian panelists, but this one's unique because it's on Indonesia. If the lawmakers and the majority of public in Indonesia is still having the revenge mentality, how can we change their mindset on the death penalty? I would ask Dr. Farah first to answer this question, and then I'll move on to Kasturi and Katrina. Each have 2 minutes to answer. Thank you.
Okay, my quick take on that is that it is natural to go on retribution, because that is what we have been trained thus far. For us, from the legal background, for instance, that's the first aim of sentencing that's been thought, rather than restorative justice, for instance, So why not, instead of focusing on punishing, we focus on forgiveness? Isn't that a greater value in forgiveness, and therefore restoring, both the offender and the community to where they should be? So more efforts need to be made for giving people alternatives. It is not easy, definitely, because like I said, the notion that eye for an eye, which I think Papa ada sebut tadi, eye for an eye principle, the retributive principle, is so deeply ingrained, but we need to change that. We need to propound on the overwhelming greater benefits on focusing on restorative justice, as opposed to focusing on retribution alone. So that would be my first point. Number 2 is, of course, go back to religion. Because some of the greatest retentionists on this go back to religion. They say that, it is enshrined in the death penalty, is in there in the religious teachings. But then again, in the same religious teaching as well, the CSOs principle focuses on forgiveness. So why not focus on the other aspect? Why pick and choose on what you want to do? So again, I think engagement with scholars on how we can actually advocate this issue better and to get in greater buy-ins from the society and from the community, I think is very, very important. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. Kasturi?
Thank you, Aldo. So I echo what Dr. Farah has said. I think what people want to see is crimes committed being punished. And time again, what they see sometimes is that certain crimes committed by certain people not being given the due punishment they deserve. For example, when you're talking about trafficked persons, you also read at the same time officials in the immigration department, officials in customs, border patrol, who are also corrupted, who have also been detained or charged and convicted for abusing their power and position, etc. So you find that, the lay person, the warga marhain, would feel that, because you are in such a position, you're protected by certain people or the law. So this sort of frustration builds up that the law is applied differently. And I think this feeds on to this sentiment of revenge. But I think it's also how the media reports news. What I feared a lot was during the whole discussion of the abolition of the mandatory death penalty, almost daily or every 2-3 days, you would hear a very bad murder committed somewhere, child being raped, and then you find that the public turns against you and says, so the government wants to abolish the mandatory death penalty. How is it going to treat people like this then? So there has been a vacuum in between the people, the readers, and the media, and how they report this sort of news. And I must say that YB Ram Karpal did his best to engage with the media prior to the bill being read in Parliament, so the media could understand what was being abolished, what was being kept, and the way forward on strengthening the criminal justice system. At the same time, I think I also want to bring up perhaps this point on criminal responsibility and mental health. Over time, we have heard and seen people who say, mendengar bisikan voices in their head telling them to do something. How do we deal with that? Fortunately or unfortunately, COVID has exposed a broken system we have in our country. How countries in the region also, I believe, lack expertise on psychologists and psychiatrists, and this leads to a situation where a murder is committed and the person is either a person undiagnosed with a mental health illness. Is the person that therefore criminally responsible for his action or not, or criminally irresponsible? And I think this is something we need to also talk about. I agree with Dr. Farah that there needs to be more explanation. The subject of the death penalty cannot be only left to MPs to talk about. It cannot be only left to NGOs to talk about. It cannot be only left to the elites to talk about, the urbanites to talk about and support, and then neglect the viewpoints of those in the rural areas. And by saying, pemikiran yang kuno, pemikiran yang kolot, it has to be something, the government must invest its resources to ensure Malaysians as a whole understand. Of course, no single parliament on earth has ever successfully and happily passed the abolition of the death penalty. Even countries that have a great success stories have had resistance within its parliament, resistance within its country. But I believe we come from countries that are not just homogeneous, we come from countries that have different cultures, different languages, different religions, different belief systems, and therefore all this put together must not necessarily clash when it comes to ideas of universal values like this. I believe in forgiveness. Yes, I believe that when a crime is committed, a life has been taken, there has to be justice for the family. I do not believe in the death penalty as a form of justice. The person must be punished, but not as not using the death penalty. Because it will never end. This cycle of violence, baying blood for blood will never end. And given ASEAN's idea of a non-interference policy, I think it's a double-edged sword. In the case of Singapore and the number of Malaysians executed in Singapore, there's this, we cannot get involved because Singapore is a sovereign country, they have their own laws, etc. Yes, but when a Malaysian citizen that is found to be unjustly tried, are you going to just rest on your laurels and say, because Singapore has its own laws, therefore you cannot interfere? No, like the EU, I think ASEAN has a great potential to be on the same page when we talk about abolishing the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasturi. Katrina?
Thank you. And just to build on what my colleague spoke about, I think that people, when a crime happens, are trying to find answers, and the use of the death penalty has really shrunk our imagination and understanding about actually what is possible. We've been sort of trained to believe that these are magical solutions, but actually all they do, as Kasturi said, is extend suffering for other communities. And so I think that, it is really our responsibility, both whether it's through research or public education, to really have those conversations with people about, okay, what do we want from the criminal justice system, right? What does it look like? The goal of incarceration cannot just be to punish and disappear somebody away. It has to be about rehabilitation, because these are individuals who come from our community, and we have to figure out how there is a way for them to return back to community. There are questions and really deep discussions that we must have about what it means to have justice. And what does it mean for there to be genuine support for people who have suffered crimes, or victims' families? And there's no straightforward answers to it, but you have to make space for us to think that through together. There also must be a lot of cross-sharing of knowledge across our countries and our borders, learning from how people think that when you abolish the death penalty, crime rates go up, and we've seen that is not true, and that has been, there's been really great research that's been done in many different countries that show the opposite, and so we can learn from that. I think the conversation, like shifting away to talk about what does it mean to have a public health approach to drugs, what is, if we take away all the resources that we've put towards just punishment and capital punishment, and put it towards investing in supporting communities, really addressing the root causes of crimes. I think people have that capacity to think differently, but we need to free ourselves just from that, again, this limited view that, this horrible act is going to solve, but actually all it does is disappear and extend the harm. And so I think, finally, if you remember what Dr. Farah said about the Roger Hood study, public perception can change. People do need to be given opportunities to understand really what it means when the death penalty is used, understand who we are killing and the effects on their families. And so it's our responsibility to make those opportunities for people to think about, actually, when we give permission to the state to kill somebody, to take a life, why are we okay with that, and how else can we exist as a people? And finally, everywhere where the death penalty has been abolished, government really has to take leadership, and that is absolutely key. And so I want to see that continue in Malaysia, and I think it's certainly possible in Indonesia and the rest of the region too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vara, Kasturi, and Katrina, for giving a very thorough answer on the specific question. Now I'll turn back to speak in bahasa Indonesia. Kawan-kawan, saya mohon maaf sekali karena sepertinya masih banyak pertanyaan, namun waktu kita sudah habis. Saya berusaha menghormati jadwal masing-masing panelis di sini, sehingga saya memutuskan untuk tidak lagi memberikan pertanyaan untuk dijawab di forum ini. Namun saya tetap mendorong kawan-kawan sekalian, jika masih ada yang mengganjal di hati, untuk dapat mengontak para panelis melalui medium media sosial lembaganya masing-masing. Ada Amnesty International Indonesia di Instagram, ada di Twitter, dan mana lagi saya lupa, seperti ada di LinkedIn dan Facebook. Kemudian ada Amnesty Malaysia, kemudian ada LBH Masyarakat, kemudian ada Suhakam, dan lain-lain. Namun terlepas daripada itu, saya percaya bahwa sesi ini setidaknya mampu memberikan gambaran tentang dampak dan kompleksitas yang ada, yang kental terasa di isu penghapusan hukuman mati. Dari sesi ini kita bisa tahu bahwa terdapat kemajuan, kemenangan-kemenangan kecil yang harus kita rayakan, namun di lain pihak juga masih terdapat banyak pekerjaan rumah untuk menuju penghapusan hukuman mati yang total dan menyeluruh. Saya ingin berterima kasih kepada masing-masing pembicara sekali lagi, dan ingin mengajak masing-masing pembicara jika berkenan untuk membagikan paparannya kepada kawan-kawan Amnesty Indonesia, agar nanti kawan-kawan Amnesty Indonesia dapat unggah di media sosial maupun di website untuk dapat diakses oleh publik. Dengan begitu, saya tutup peluncuran laporan kita hari ini. Jangan lupa untuk mendukung Amnesty International dan gerakan-gerakan serupa dalam upaya kami untuk mempromosikan penegakan hak asasi manusia di berbagai belahan dunia, termasuk juga kerja-kerja dari LBH Masyarakat, dari Suhakam, atau orang-orang seperti Kasturi. Terima kasih, selamat siang, sampai jumpa di lain kesempatan, dan kawan-kawan dapat mengunduh laporan lengkap tren penggunaan